Hi, my name is Greg Krasovsky. I'm an attorney and a former police officer. To talk to you today about the filing for bankruptcy by the Boy Scouts of America. I was asked to give a TV interview about it, and it's a really sad day for scouting, but in some ways, what it reminds us of is in organizations as large and as old as the Boy Scouts, I think on February 8th they celebrated their 110th anniversary. Sexual abuse cannot be tolerated and cannot be covered up. It's really sad that throughout all these years you had so many Boy Scout personnel take advantage of vulnerable minor children and abuse them. It's even sadder, or just as sad as that, you've had people in the organization who must have been aware of it, made aware of it by maybe the scouts themselves or their parents or other scout troop leaders, and for some reason did not take appropriate action and instead chose to cover it up without being afraid for potential civil and criminal consequences, as we say, ramifications or repercussions. Question is why? Well, it has to do, I guess, with the trend of the times back then and with the laws and the way they were enforced. But we're also talking about claims that are less than 20 or 30 years old. Surely in the 80s and 1990s, people should have known that if you're going to abuse a minor child, you can face serious consequences under relevant criminal statutes, both state and federal. But apparently those who covered it up did not believe that they would ever be charged for it or be ever held personally, civilly liable. Hopefully that will change. But we've seen the same situation with the lawsuits that we've had over the years against the Catholic Church and the abuse at the hands of priests. But right now, Boy Scouts of America, I think, have no choice but to shield themselves legally from this expected tide of lawsuits. They're facing hundreds, if not thousands, of potential claims. I think they had some court testimony this last year that showed that, if I'm not mistaken, 12,000 victims, at least 12,000 victims that they've been able to identify, and over 75 or 7,800 Boy Scout personnel who may have been involved in the abuse or the cover-up. Those are just horrific numbers. Given the verdict that they've had, this was what, in 2010, $18 million verdict, obviously the Boy Scouts will go bankrupt. If one victim was awarded $18 million, and you have law firms representing hundreds of claimants, then imagine what this would do. But as a lawyer who has experience working with local counsel and bankruptcy courts, representing creditors, as well as debtors, my advice to you is as follows. If you or anyone you know has been a victim of this in the Boy Scout organization, and now has to face the prospects of, instead of filing a lawsuit in their local court, whether state or federal, now they have to become part of this bankruptcy court action in Delaware, don't hesitate. Give us a call ASAP. So my law offices, in conjunction with local Delaware bankruptcy counsel that I've worked with for many years, will be able to help you out. That's important. Don't wait. In terms of what's going to happen, well, I'm sure negotiations are going to start, because the Boy Scouts within the bankruptcy process are going to say that they can only pay so much over so many years. So budget will be determined and allocated for the payout of these claims. Then they're going to come up with criteria for claimants. In other words, depending what happened to a person, how much they'll be potentially entitled to. Obviously there's going to be a threshold that you have to meet to be a claimant. And that takes into account lots of factors. When this happened, the evidence that was available to the claimant, witness testimony, the credibility of personal testimony by the victim, any documentary evidence, how many times this happened, the severity of the abuse, right? Not to mention the frequency of the abuse, as well as the people involved. Was it a local leader, Boy Scout or Cub Scout leader? Was it someone else? The severity of the cover-up, whether complaints were made at the time either to the Boy Scouts, by the scout himself or his parents or relatives or legal guardians, whether complaints were made to the local law enforcement or to, for instance, medical service providers, including pediatric physicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, things like that. And they're going to come up with a formula of how much people will receive. And then once all this is negotiated and eventually approved by the court, then payouts will be made. But if you've been a victim, you need to make sure that you go through all these steps, that you're properly represented, and that you'll be entitled to receive fair and just compensation. But in this case, fair and just compensation will be what's been determined within the bankruptcy process. Now, bankruptcy courts aren't just courts of law, they're also courts of equity. So they're supposed to come up with a fair solution. But I think given the nonprofit nature of the Boy Scouts, they know that there's a limited amount of money that's available to claimants without killing the organization. And doesn't make sense to do that because scouting serves valid, useful, educational, and developmental purposes, and we'll be all worse without the Boy Scouts of America, worse off. So the amount that they're going to allocate is going to be determined by the financial abilities of the organization today and going forward based on how much they can collect in dues through other charitable events and activities, donations, things like that. But the most important thing is, regardless of the setting, if you or anyone else you know has been a victim of sexual abuse, whether as adults or as minors, talk to a lawyer about it. Find out what your options are. Find out what you can do to protect yourself. Find out what you can do to make sure that justice prevails and the people who did this to you get the punishment that they deserve. As importantly, are identified and hopefully prevented from doing this to other people in the future. That's extremely important. Because often when I talk to victims of sexual abuse, they want to put it behind them. And I've always said this as a lawyer and as a police officer. Don't just think about yourself as a victim if you just simply let this go. Think of what that perpetrator is going to do to others if he gets away with it or gets a slap on the wrist. Especially sexual predators who are being predatory not just against adults who can resist and who can defend themselves, but are also doing this to vulnerable, to helpless children. So if you're a victim or you're a witness who knows about something like this, please talk to us or to other lawyers to make sure that your rights are protected and make sure that justice prevails. On the other side of the coin, in this area, we've also had, unfortunately, a history of some false allegations being made against people as well. Not just in the scouting setting, but also in educational facilities, in medical facilities, in other places, even in the workplace. So if you are a potential victim of a false claim of sexual abuse, of sexual harassment, someone is making these claims against you just to damage your reputation, to hurt you, to get back at you for something you may have done or they think you have done to them. Or they're doing this to gain advantage in other proceedings, whether it's in the context of a labor dispute, or get advantage in divorce or custody proceedings, which is something we see as well. False allegations of domestic abuse being made to get advantage, an unfair and absolutely evil advantage in these proceedings. Then talk to us as well, because you definitely need help. Regardless of the state you're in, my law officer will be able to put you in touch, help you, and put you in touch with local lawyers that we work with, who can make the court appearances locally, who practice locally, and who'll be able to defend you locally with whatever assistance that I and my colleagues can provide. That's about it. And let's just hope that the outcome of this bankruptcy filing by the Boy Scouts of America is the best one possible. people get some fair and adequate compensation. This case gets publicity and will serve an example to prevent this from happening to others, especially children. Thank you. Well, I guess we'll try to shut this down manually.